Again, or hello to those who've just joined us. As I've been here already this evening for a little while, my name is Dr. Kate Dellenbush, and this evening we're continuing our Eclipse lecture series, our interdisciplinary lecture series, where we've started with some astronomy topics and then on to history and music, and we're continuing that this evening. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Colin Hochstetler. And let me tell you a little bit about him. So he's a recent BGSU graduate, graduate here just this past fall with a bachelor's in music history. And he's been researching planetariums that we're going to hear about this evening, some of that work for the last couple of years. And he worked as an undergraduate supervisor in the music library in the Bill Schurk Sound Archives, the library here on campus. And he was also recently hired as the polka preservation assistant at the music library as well. And he'll be attending a graduate program in musicology next fall. So he's just starting doing great things. And so it's great for us to be able to hear about some of his work that he's already done this evening. All right, so thank you, Colin.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Dellenbush, for the introduction. I'm super happy to be here. So Dr. Dellenbush said a lot about what I do already, but I think I should say a little bit more because it might be confusing to see the planetarium heavy title of my talk right next to my very polka heavy job title. You might be asking yourself, how does someone who works with polka have any authority to talk about planetariums? After all, planetariums are often used for talks on space science. I'm by no means a scientist. And as far as I know, there is no outer space polka, not that I found yet anyway. If you know of any, please let me know. But before I began my job as a polka preservation assistant at BGSU's music library, I had been researching planetariums and specifically the music in planetariums for about 2 years. Specifically, I've been looking at how music is paired with visual imagery inside the space that we are in right now. So a brief history about my research. In 2022, I traveled to various planetariums in Michigan and Ohio to speak with planetarium directors and watch over a dozen planetarium shows in context. I also spent some time researching self-proclaimed planetarium music composers and studied the synthesized sounds they made to accompany the spacey visuals we're all used to in this space. After this, I got curious about where some of these musical traditions came from and how music was used in planetariums before synthesizers were invented. So in October of 2023, I conducted archival research at the Adler Planetarium, which was the first planetarium in the United States, having opened in 1930. Searching through the archives, I found outlines, scripts, and music lists for lectures that took place throughout the Adler's entire history. I learned that prior to 1969, classical music was the only music to be heard in Adler programs, but we'll get to that a little bit later because as I was searching through these documents, I also unexpectedly came across programs from the 60s, 70s, and 80s that featured solar eclipse demonstrations. This brings me to the focus of my talk, investigating how music was paired with solar eclipse demonstrations at the Adler Planetarium. With that being said, I'm going to stop here momentarily because I want you all to ask yourselves, how often do you think about music that we hear inside of planetariums? We don't usually go to planetariums to hear the music inside of them. We usually go to be immersed underneath some awesome space imagery, or we go to learn about astronomy and related sciences. But it's important to remember that the music that accompanies these shows contributes to the quality of the planetarium's immersive magic. If you've been to a planetarium show, you might be familiar with the fact that music is often played constantly in the background alongside a narration and animations. Yet, in the planetarium's long history, the experience wasn't always like this. So in order to contextualize the solar eclipse demonstrations we're going to be looking at, I'm now going to give a brief history on the development of planetariums and the music within them. And I hope that by the end of this talk, you'll be familiar with a few key concepts. How the societal function of planetariums changed over time, how music in planetariums changed over time, and how eclipses were presented to Adler audiences throughout the 20th century. After some historical context, we're going to hear some eclipse demonstrations as they might have happened all the way in those years, in those decades ago. So now, history. The modern planetarium, as we know it, was first built in 1923 in Jena, Germany. It took years of engineering for a man named Walter Bauersfeld, an engineer.
Are you sitting in the chair now? Are you sitting in the chair now? No. We gotta sign up.
Okay. So I don't know where that audio came from, but anyway, so it took years for Walter Bauersfeld, an engineer who worked for the Carl Zeiss firm, to come up with a projection system that would accurately represent the stars as we see them in the night sky. Centuries before, people around the world had constructed spherical wooden contraptions and orreries to represent the sky above. But the Zeiss firm was a 20th century company that specialized in making optical instruments. And Bauersfeld was interested in building a machine that used lenses and light bulbs to accurately project stars. After inventing the Zeiss Mark I projector, he and a team of many other people tested it on the rooftop of the Zeiss firm. It was a huge success, and in 1924, the first official public planetarium opened at the Deutsches Museum in Munich, Germany. Planetariums then quickly spread across Western Europe and found their way to the United States with the Adler in 1930. It did not take long for other major planetariums, such as the Hayden in New York City and the Griffith in Los Angeles, to follow suit. And I'll be focusing primarily on these American planetariums for the rest of the talk. So for most of the planetarium's history, lecturers operated massive star projectors and presented in-person lectures. There were no fancy computer graphics displayed on the dome. Rather, scientists would use analog Zeiss projectors to produce all of the visual demonstrations. These machines could project all the stars of the night sky as seen from the northern or southern hemisphere, as well as the sun, the moon, the planets, and with some additional slides, they could even project the Andromeda Galaxy, specific nebula, and constellations. One slight caveat though, unlike projection systems today, these early star projectors could only project the night sky as we can see it from the surface of the Earth. Over time though, these machines grew more complex and were eventually aided by slide projectors like the one I'm using right now, which could project a flat image onto portions of the dome, depending on where in the room they were situated. So from its inception through the 1950s, the planetarium was seen first and foremost as an educational space, and new locations sprout up rapidly thanks to the growth in popularity of cheaper star projectors that competed against Zeiss. At the Adler, astronomers would teach the public about all sorts of astronomical subjects, as you can hopefully see with the documents on the screen right here. According to an internal memo in the archives, they structured their programs so that the public could, quote, receive a fundamental course in astronomy in a period of about 2 years, end quote. Each individual program would be put on for a full month to ensure that large quantities of the people in Chicago could come and see it. These lectures were, quote, selected when possible to illustrate current astronomical phenomena of particular interest, end quote. And to ensure that the occasional visitor who wasn't coming every month could still get an enjoyable experience out of the programs, they tried to make each topic independent of the other. The goal of the planetarium, whether in a school or at a standalone institution, was to educate the public on recent findings in astronomy. Looking at this Adler 2-year schedule, this educational focus can be seen really clearly. Programs taught the public about planetary and stellar motions, the seasons, stars, and various topics on the science behind the stars and the solar system. This educational outlook ultimately shaped how music was used in American planetariums from 1930 to the 50s. That is, music was not something of major consideration during this time. Compared to music in planetarium shows of today, where music is specifically composed to match visual imagery and is played constantly, early planetarium lectures used music sparingly. Music's limited use in these early planetariums makes sense with the educational focus of the space. People didn't go to planetariums for pure entertainment like they would with the cinema. People went to planetariums to learn about astronomy, and the novelty of the massive projector in the middle of the room combined with the stars on the dome was entertaining enough. And of course, based on scripts that I've seen, the directors would throw in the occasional pun when they were speaking too. The only evidence I found of music's use at the Adler during this early period came from a single piece of paper dated 1934, as you can see on the screen now, in which 2 minutes of unspecified music bookended the lecture. But things started to change in the 1950s, a time that was pivotal for all planetariums because it was, of course, pivotal for the United States at large. In October of 1957, amidst the Cold War, the space race began with the launch of Soviet Russia's Sputnik satellite. After the launch of Sputnik, the United States developed what came to be viewed by scholars as an inferiority complex in their space research capabilities. Suddenly, the West was being left out of the brand new space age. This had a huge impact on planetariums. Sputnik and the anxieties it brought to the American people caused a surge of public interest towards planetariums. And in fact, right after Sputnik's launch, estimations show that approximately 100,000 people more every year started coming to the Adler, and that number only got bigger every year following. The public wanted to learn about astronomy and space science, and planetarium directors felt that they needed to do something new to accommodate all of these new people. What they felt they needed to do is clearly documented in the 1958 Symposium on Planetaria and their use for education. This symposium was a gathering of planetarium directors and enthusiasts in which post-Sputnik ideas about the values of planetariums in society were shared. I could honestly spend hours talking about all of the things that were discussed in this symposium. There's so much information, so I'm just going to very quickly summarize some of the things that directors talked about. They felt that it was their duty to make the younger generation interested in the sciences. They felt that adults had to be prepared to live in the new space age. They believed that planetarium programs should become more dramatic. They called for music to be used more often throughout the whole program. They called for recognizable classical music to be paired with imagery based on mood. And they stressed the importance of using appropriate sounding music at the right moment to heighten a dramatic impact of a statement or projection. After this national 1958 symposium, the nature of the planetarium program began to change in the United States. Music and sound effects were used more often. The climactic moments of musical pieces were lined up with projections so that there was more dramatic impact. Narration and music started getting recorded together so that precise timings could be kept and reused. I like to call this change the beginning of the cinematification of the planetarium experience, because it was at this time, after the 1958 symposium, when programs became less like lectures and more like planetarium shows. Significantly, these changes can be seen in the Adler's institutional records. In the 1960s, a wave of newly formatted documents just suddenly appeared in the archive. Suddenly, the Adler was making detailed outlines and music lists for each program. These music lists started small, but grew larger as the 1960s progressed. Instructions to cue music at certain times were listed, as were specific durations for each piece of music. And similarly significant, all of these selections were pieces of classical music, with the most of them being orchestral. Pieces by composers such as Holst, Debussy, Wagner, Stravinsky, Rachmaninoff, and Richard Strauss were commonplace. The same thing can be seen at the Griffith Observatory. In the late 1960s, they actually published a sample of their music catalog that they used regularly, and it too only featured classical music. So from 1930 to the late 1960s, at least from what I have found in my research thus far, classical music was the only music used in American planetariums. There are a number of historical reasons for why this might be a case. I could, again, spend hours talking about that. But one that I would like to highlight is that at this point in time, the planetarium itself was seen as a very stately and scientific space. It was perceived as a place for education and high culture. So for its directors and the middle to upper class people that attended the shows, classical music was the only music really deemed appropriate. To provide proof at this point, I'd like to share a quote that a staff member of the Griffith Observatory said in the late 1960s. "The selections played should tend to have more popular appeal. This is not to say that popular or rock and roll music should be used. The atmosphere of the planetarium should retain a certain dignity. The best selections are usually light classical or moderately heavy classical. It's quite the quote, and I think it kind of shows us what these people were thinking was appropriate for their space. Now, classical music's control of the planetarium's sonic environment would not last forever. Over the course of a few years, it was switched out for new sounds. Thanks to the popularity of sci-fi films and albums like Wendy Carlos's 1968 Switched on Bach, an album of various Bach pieces recorded with the Moog synthesizer, synthesized music became all the rage amongst the American public. Carlos started a national and really worldwide trend of synthesizing classical music, and this trend very quickly found its way into the planetarium. Many people, including planetarium directors, started believing that synthesized music could be, quote unquote, genuine. As if on cue, records of the Adler after 1968 indicate that synthesized versions of classical music got mixed in with original recordings of classical music. In the early years of the 70s, synthesized music slowly became more and more commonplace in planetarium productions until non-classical synthesized music eventually replaced classical music altogether. This was happening at the same time that live lecturers were being replaced with taped narrations, further leading the planetarium program down a cinematic path. Musicians involved with planetariums even started composing original music for productions for the very first time. For example, Mark Peterson, also known as Geodesium, composed synthesized music for the Fisk Planetarium in Colorado in 1975. And he got so much positive feedback from the public that he started releasing albums and writing music for planetariums across the entire country. Now, if you have heard synthesized music from the early 70s, I'm sure you know what this is about to sound like. Prepare yourself. I don't know about you, but that's pretty different from Wagner. So you can see that stuff was starting to change. I'd like to point out that the introduction of synthesizers to the planetarium and a growing association between the sounds we just heard with things like otherworldly spacey visuals broke down the highbrow attitude towards music in planetariums. Geodesium is a testament to that. Rather suddenly, classical music was no longer the most appropriate music for the space, and lots of strange and new synthesized sounds found their way in. In the 1980s, standard ambient and new age music began making its way into planetarium as it saw an increase in popularity throughout the country. Music from the classical canon had by this point more or less moved aside as newer forms of music, which seemed to fit the kind of spacey aesthetic of the more entertainment-driven planetarium, took its place. One prominent composer who wrote music for planetariums in this style was John Serry. He composed something called space music, which is considered a genre of electronic music characterized by long, meditative electronic passages built on slowly evolving chord changes, a rhythmic pulse, and a suspension of tension. So let's take a listen to a portion of one of his pieces composed for a planetarium show. This is called Mystery Road. So around the same time that this music was coming out, the mid-1980s also saw the invention of digital projection technology. With this technology, planetariums could abandon their analog star projectors and project any computer animated material onto the dome. For the first time, visuals in the planetarium could represent space objects as they were seen from anywhere in the universe, or they could show imaginary objects, not just the stars as seen from the surface of the Earth. Although not all planetariums adopted this technology right away, today it's really rare to find a planetarium that still actively uses their old analog star projector. And if you were here for the show, we were using our analog projector, but that's only because our digital system is currently down. It's not used very often. So this digital development, alongside rapid changes in music norms, also contributed to the cinematification of the planetarium experience. Today, the creation of fully cinematic productions has become more mainstream, thanks to digital projection technology, which improved further in the early 2000s. Planetariums can fully animate and produce their own shows and then sell them to other planetariums. The planetarium experience, now fully entertainment-driven, has become commodified. Large production studios will reach out to composers prominent in film and ask them to compose for a show. Interestingly, music in shows today often actually utilizes a combination of original orchestral music and electronics. Simple and relaxing piano melodies are frequently used alongside ambient electronic music, and references to popular orchestral works such as Stravinsky's Firebird are commonplace. It's almost as if the musical trends over the course of the entire planetarium's history have suddenly been joined into one, and composers are utilizing both orchestral music and electronic music. So the planetarium now functions more like a documentary. And in film, music plays for nearly the entire duration of a show. Long gone are the days of live spoken lectures. Now it's all about major production companies, as demonstrated by the credits that are on the screen of a show I saw right here really recently. So to summarize this history, I made a cool timeline for you. Planetarium music has a really interesting past. From 1930 to the very late 1960s, it featured pretty much exclusively music from the Western classical canon. In the late 50s, planetariums became more entertainment-driven due to the space race, so classical music was used more heavily in the average program. In the very late 60s, synthesized versions of classical music entered the mix. By the 70s, original synthesized works were being composed for planetarium programs, and by the mid-80s, we have evidence of planetariums leaning into the entertainment industry and utilizing ambient and new age music, giving the site an association with spacey, spiritual, or meditative ideas, all while retaining a focus on educating the public about astronomical topics. In the 90s, leading into the 2000s, shows became truly cinematic or documentative, and original music tended to focus on orchestral themes with electronic sounds mixed in to contribute to the spacey atmosphere. And this trend still continues today. So now that we have a pretty good background on the history of music in planetariums, let's look at music for a solar eclipse demonstration at the Adler Planetarium, because that's why we're all here, right? So the first selection we will look at is from a 1968 program titled Stonehenge in the Story of Eclipses. Being from 1968, this program has a heavy selection of classical music. For the eclipse, a movement of Edvard Grieg's Peer Gynt Suite No. 1 was selected. This was the death of Ace. Before we listen to the selection, let's go over some contextual information. The Peer Gynt Suites, of which there are two, are collections of music put together by the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg. The music in these suites originally came from incidental music Grieg wrote for Henrik Ibsen's play called Peer Gynt, which was a story about the adventures of a young Norwegian. Ibsen wrote the drama in 1867, but didn't originally want it to be performed, so he waited until 1874 to ask Grieg to write music for it. By 76, the play was premiered with Grieg's music, and Grieg later published two suites comprised of music from the play in 1888 and 93, and today, the music from these suites is much more popular than the play itself. The particular movement used in the Adler is, in its original context, played as Peer returns home to find that his mother has died. However, this context is, of course, not retained in the Adler. The title and original meaning are less relevant when you put it with eclipse imagery. Rather, it was selected for an eclipse demonstration because of its sound, and likely because audiences would be familiar with it. So to hear this piece performed as it would have possibly been in the Adler, and to attempt to figure out why directors chose this piece of music for an eclipse demonstration, I edited an eclipse animation and synced the music with it. This animation doesn't likely capture the way that demonstrations actually looked in 1968. This is just the best representation I could find for this. Because what is most important is how the music is timed with it. And so as a note, this animation was produced by creators of a YouTube channel called Sun Earth Days. I just used it and then edited it a little bit. And this version of the piece was recorded by the Malmö Symphony Orchestra in Sweden. So if we could actually maybe have the lights get turned down a little bit, I'm gonna sit down and let you just enjoy this little bit of music here. So paired with eclipse imagery, I'd like to ask for some audience participation. What does this piece remind you of? Why might a planetarium director have selected this piece of music as fitting for an eclipse demonstration? Would anyone like to share their thoughts about what they heard or what they thought fit? Yeah.
I thought it was perfect. beginning part, the melody goes up, and it gives us a feeling of anticipation. Something's going to happen over and over and over as we watch it. Oh, and it's kind of slow. And then when it's completed and it starts to dissipate, music goes down. Ready for, yeah.
Dr. Navik, that is exactly what I had as well. That's exactly what I had. So did anyone else kind of like hear anything different that they'd like to share? So Dr. Navik pointed out the fact that the melodic line kind of like rises up and up, and then we have this huge climactic moment, and then it goes down. And it's kind of like, it's dramatic, yeah. And so in the lecture outline, it was specifically usually asked that the climactic moments of a piece were paired with the big whatever, right? And so directors likely thought that this particular piece was really good because it had a very nice slow motion into the climactic moment and a slow motion away from it. You can think of combining slow movements in visuals with slow movements in music, and they fit really nicely together. So I'm going to go on to the next one now. The next selection we'll look at is from a 1972 Adler production titled Astronomy in the Age of Aquarius. Being from 1972, it is not surprising that this program had a mix of classical music and synthesized music, and even had popular music from films and television shows of the time, such as Midnight Cowboy. Yeah, the musical selection for the eclipse is not so obvious to find in this music list, but after searching through the outline of this program, it is made clear that Ralph Vaughan Williams' Prelude from Sinfonia Antarctica is paired with a demonstration of the total solar eclipse. So again, before I show the animation, let's go over just a little bit of contextual information. Sinfonia Antarctica is Vaughan Williams' 7th symphony. It is in 5 movements, and the particular movement used by the Adler is the first prelude. The music for the symphony was originally written for the 1948 British adventure film Scott of the Antarctic, but was reworked into a symphony by Vaughan Williams in 1952. This symphonic form is what most people recognize today. Since the music was written for a story about an adventure in Antarctica, Vaughan Williams explored elements of wind, cold, as well as bravery in the face of unforgiving nature. And of film music, Vaughan Williams held the opinion that when the same musical material was used for different images, each image would make the music sound different, or in other words, it would create new meaning. So maybe staff at the Adler thought that this music's association with bravery, mystery, and cold weather would fit nicely with the solar eclipse. So here's another animation. Cues in the outline indicate that only a small portion of the prelude was used, and archival recordings from the Adler seem to always use just the first 2 minutes of the prelude. So I've decided to do the same thing here. This one's going to be a little bit different, but really similar. And I'm going to stay standing this time because it's pretty short. So here we go. Oh, by the way, this recording is by the Bournemouth Symphony Orchestra in England. So again, let's talk about what makes this music seem to fit a solar eclipse demonstration. Would anyone like to share what they liked or maybe disliked about this one?
So what I noticed at the difference between the two, first is about holding a certain creed, and the second one has a triumphal aspect to it. It's very common, even though there are no signs of difficulty. The part of the music suggests that a success, and so there's more of a sense of power and mastery.
Yeah, I like that. Just in case anyone didn't hear, there's more triumph in this one. It's less about mystery, but there's just a lot of triumphant sounds in motion. Would anyone else like to share what they thought?
I think with both of these, there's in different ways, they're both repeating the same melody or melodic fragment over and over and over and over again in increasing or decreasing intensity, and that kind of a thing over the course of like a couple minutes and paired with imagery like this, I think can really evoke this feeling of being a really small piece or a small cog in a vast grand machine that is the universe, if we want to get to that kind of imagery. And I think that in different ways, whether it's like, oh, I'm just a very small player in the Puritan kind of context, or in the second Sophia and Jessica, this kind of like the overcoming the words, overcoming the I don't know, gap in the grandeur of how massive everything is. I feel like this kind of like ad nauseum repetition of the same thing over and over again just sort of builds up this mass of sound and space.
Right. I like that. I like that a lot. So there are a lot of different ways how we could interpret maybe why the Adler staff chose certain pieces. And so now we're going to move on to another one. This next example from the Adler comes from a 1977 program titled A Universe of Color. This show is quite interesting, and I actually have a full-length archived recording of its audio. And so since there's a full narration alongside the music, I decided it would be fun to take a listen to this Adler show exactly as it would have been heard close to 50 years ago. So as we're listening, take note of how different this one is compared to the other two examples that we just heard. I think we'll figure out the differences quickly, but I really want us to listen closely to how the music changes at different topics. So the recording starts with the topic of a sunrise, then it moves to the eclipse, and then it ends with a talk about sunlight. So think about what the music is doing to create a relevant mood for each topic as we go to it.
The glory of a sunrise, its hues of red and orange, changing night unto day as the world awakens. We often linger a moment to behold this unfolding drama. Gradually, the tints of dawn give way to the clear blue sky. We are so used to seeing a blue sky that we tend to take it for granted. Yet, except for Mars, the skies of other planets are either cloudy or black. Some make special plans and travel hundreds of miles to watch day change to night during those powerfully moving moments of an eclipse of the sun. Next October 12th, the moon will totally cover the sun for people aboard cruise ships in the Pacific. Here at the Mount Palomar Observatory in California, about half of the sun will be covered. And in Chicago, the sun will have a 13% bite out of it in the late afternoon.
When the moon passes in front of the sun, the sky quickly darkens, and the land or sea takes on a strange color. Then a wave of darkness approaches, and faint shadow bands ripple across the land. Finally, the last shaft of sunlight glints through a lunar valley like a dazzling diamond. As we peer into a telescope, we see huge plumes of brilliant pink gases leap off the sun's vanishing rim. The full beauty of the eclipse is seen in the pearlescent glow of the sun's corona. This outer atmosphere of the sun is normally seen only during eclipses. The graceful corona is different for each eclipse and is ever changing with activity on the sun.
As the moon continues on its way, the sun blazes forth once more with its blinding brilliance. The eclipse is over.
So obviously, this was not classical. This was synthesized music. And I want to point out just a couple of things. Did you hear how the music contrasted, or how the music was different from before the eclipse, during the eclipse, and after the eclipse? Prior, it was very peaceful. It was like a sonic painting of a blue sky. It really nicely matched the imagery that the narrator was saying. During the eclipse, it almost sounded dangerous. It was like there was an implied danger or unknown force that was coming to take the sun away. And after the moon moved out of the way, synthesized sounds that kind of like fell down with each other and layered over each other were meant to represent kind of the sunlight peeking out from behind the moon again. So this one was a really interesting example. And so this, at the Adler, one thing I want to point out is that a lot of the programs talked about how ancient people thought of the eclipse, or how we think ancient people thought of the eclipse. And so this kind of conception of mystery for the eclipse is kind of a paradox, because even though the eclipse is being described scientifically in the narration, the music still carries a mysterious quality to it. We know that eclipses aren't bringing forth the end of the world, and we know how they work, yet the music and narration were designed to make an audience feel this sense of mystery and excitement. This is a prime example, I think, of how the planetarium combined education and entertainment in response to the space race and the political context of the Cold War. So one more example that we'll look at. This is another archived recording from the Adler. This one is from 1986. It's titled 7 Wonders of the Universe. And it takes audiences on a tour through the solar system and beyond. And you guessed it, one of the wonders is a total solar eclipse. So this example is different because music is played in the background of the show for the whole thing. Just like we learned in the historical timeline, at this point in time, music was pretty much a constant force. So rather than music being different for the eclipse, it was kind of similar throughout the whole program. So we don't get a specific piece of music for the eclipse. We rather get an established mood. So this one is a little bit different from the others. And listen closely to how the music and the narration work together.
Eclipses are our third wonder of the universe. They occur only because of the unique set of circumstances existing between the Earth, Sun, and Moon. Long ago, early sky watchers mapped the path of the Sun and Moon as they moved across the sky throughout the year. They noticed that the Moon's path was almost the same as the Sun's. Most of the time, the Moon crossed a little above or below the Sun. However, twice a month, the two paths crossed, and if the Moon happened to be at the crossing point, an eclipse occurred. A new moon is when the Moon is between the Earth and the Sun, and a full moon occurs when the Moon is on the opposite side of the Earth from the Sun. You might think that there should be an eclipse with every new or full moon. But remember, the Moon's path doesn't exactly match the Sun's. If the Moon is new when it crosses the Sun's path, we see a spectacular solar eclipse. because the moon blocks the sun's light. To see such an eclipse, you must actually be within the moon's shadow sweeping across the Earth, a band only about 100 miles wide. Total solar eclipses happen almost every year and only last for a few minutes. So unless you are in the shadow, you may never see an awesome total eclipse of the sun. If the moon is full when it crosses the sun's path, we see...
So in this one, it's almost like the narrator is kind of dancing with these synthetic flourishes that are happening in the background. This is a really good example of space music. So there is a constant chordal layer in the background and kind of synthy flourishes come in and out. And the narrator, at least to my ears, seemed to be intentionally speaking in a way that would match when these synth sounds were happening. And this is another good example of how perhaps the science of an eclipse and the musical mood that it established doesn't quite match, because it's talking about science, but this also sounded really disorienting and mysterious and ambiguous. So we've heard 4 eclipse demonstrations at the Adler, ranging from 1968 to 1986. I think that all 4 of these examples show us that at the Adler, music of the total solar eclipse was meant to be mysterious. No matter the selection or how it was used, it was meant to evoke some sense of awe. But the Adler is only one planetarium. Now, I'd like to end by showing a clip of a show produced by a company called Bays Mountain Productions in 2017. This is actually the show we probably would have seen tonight if the hard drive was running. This has no relation to the Adler, just as a heads up, but it gives us kind of a fun way to see how eclipses are described differently in contemporary times made by different institutions. So this is a preview fishbowl lens view of a show called Totality from the Foldom database.
The inner, dark umbra and outer, faint penumbral shadows of the moon projected on our planet, the Earth. An overlook provides a unique sight of the moon's shadow passing by. The temperature steadies, and so the wind dies down. Animals become quiet. The moon's rough surface provides gaps for sunlight to peek through, giving us Bailey's beads. The diamond ring effect. Take in the whole view. Twilight surrounds you. The brighter stars and even planets become visible. Totality. Rosy prominences from the chromosphere become apparent, and the magnificent corona.
So this music isn't mysterious, it's so hopeful. It's a completely different representation of the eclipse. And I think that no matter what, there is no right or wrong way to pair music with demonstrations in planetariums. In the past, the Adler chose to pair solar eclipse demonstrations with mysterious music, but other planetariums and production companies might have gone for a completely different mood. At the end of the day, music in planetariums is meant to influence what you feel about space science. You could say it's almost manipulating you. It's manipulating the way that you're supposed to think of the material you're being educated about. No matter the music, this has really been the case for decades. So I hope that after today, whenever you attend a planetarium show in the future, you will think about how its music is communicating meaning to you. Music and sound effects in planetariums work alongside narrations and visuals to make you feel like you are immersed in outer space. Ask yourself what the show is trying to make you feel with its music, what associations it's trying to build. And if you want to experience more planetarium music after this, you're in luck. On the day of the eclipse here at Bowling Green, the planetarium experience will be brought to the football stadium. Before and after totality on April 8th, new pieces of music composed by BGSU composition students and myself will be broadcast through the stadium speakers. All of us were asked to compose planetarium music for this day. So on the day of totality, you won't have to worry about missing the planetarium because we'll be bringing it right to you. The only difference is that unlike planetarium shows, when we're actually experiencing the real eclipse, during the moment of totality, there will be no music played. It will be completely silent so that you can reflect and make your own decisions about what it is that you're seeing and how you are interpreting it. So go out on April 8th, enjoy the eclipse, and have fun. Thanks.
What time do you plan to start the music?
I'm not entirely sure. Right now, the committee is still working out the details. I do know that we have about 10 people composing music, and each piece is about 10 to 15 minutes long. So there will probably be 5 pieces before the eclipse and 5 pieces after. But as we get closer to that date, I'm sure they'll post specific details about when the festivities are happening.
What about an hour before, an hour after?
A couple hours before and after, probably. Dr. Dellenbush, does that sound about right?
Yeah, well, the stadium will open at noon, mostly for BGSU folks and to the public at 1, but we're not going to turn people away if they're coming at noon. And I don't recall off the top of my head when the first music will be played. I'd have to look at our schedule, but it'll be interspersed before and after totality, both the original compositions as well as some other things from the band and maybe some other music as well. So there'll be a lot going on, and there'll be announcements about what those pieces are and what's happening as we go along as well.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Why don't they play the planets by Holst?
They do. So specifically Neptune from Holst's Planets is played all the time at the Adler. Almost like every other music list that I came across had that one. And both at the Adler and the Griffith, Neptune was used to kind of describe other worlds. So when other worlds were being displayed, or if slide projections were being used to show a surface of a different planet, they would often play Neptune because of its, I guess you could call it, ethereal quality, or it's the gentleness of the music. So that one was used all the time.
They might consider using Across the Universe, John Lennon's song, The Beatles.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah, so that's really interesting. For most of planetarium history, popular music wasn't really used, except there was one planetarium in Cleveland that I went to. They put together a production with an analog star projector, and it was just all popular music. They used like Star Wars themes. I think they might have played that song as well. Yeah. So it really depends on how the show is being produced and what the intentions with it are. Do you have a question?
So the previous show is 2017, 2024. What change do you think is going to be in music from something like that to now?
So I haven't personally seen a new show. I have watched a preview of a show from 2023 on the Full Dome database, and it's very similar. So right now, the trend from the early 2000s to now, the trend has very much been this kind of quasi-orchestral and electronic music. And it's really different between every single show because all of them use different composers. You never really know what you're going to get. And so I've heard a wide array of different types of music depending on, I guess, the mood that they're trying to set. But I think for at least right now, the trend is still this mix between originally composed orchestral music and electronics. If I ever get asked to compose for a planetarium show, I'll find a way to get it in. So if you know anyone that you can get me in contact with, I'd love to get polka in a planetarium show. Dr. Nuttig.
Did you ever come across planetarium music from cultures, non-Western cultures, that don't use major minor scale systems, or that don't use attitude rhythms, and use vibratos or how you back into two. Is their music different?
So there are two parts, there are two ways I can answer this. So one of the things I really want to do in the future is travel to different planetariums in different parts of the world to kind of compare and contrast if local music traditions are brought into the space. But I can tell you that at least in the United States here, there's almost, they engage with the idea of the other quite a lot in these planetarium programs. So if I saw a planetarium program once that was talking about Mayan representations and understandings of the stars, and the music was very stereotypical representations of what you would expect someone to make the Mayans sound like.
Was it stereotypical or was it actually like
Oh, it was stereotypical.
ethnomusicologists?
I interpreted it as being very stereotypical. It kind of is a callback to the way stereotypical music would be used in old films a lot too. Yeah, and so that's a lot of what I've heard so far. So I really want to try to find shows that don't do that, or find shows that utilize other music traditions in maybe a less stereotypical or problematic way. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
What do you mean by stereotypical Western music? Westerners making stereotypical images of what they think of different cultures.
Yeah. So not an actual representation of what their sounds are, but what we think they sound like with no context about their culture and its history. Yeah. June?
I was wondering if you have thought on like how in a lot of like Western classical mythology and cultures, like what this means like a lot more ominous in a lot of the stuff like that. We thought about exploring that in different cultures where they like for like just the concept of space is it like mystified or like in a sense like vilified?
Yeah, so I haven't
You repeat the question.
oh, so the question was, have I considered looking at, can you say again, so like eclipse demonstrations that aren't?
Yeah, like a culture that doesn't consider like environmental things that like such as eclipse that's something that's like to be like ominous or
So like
vilified.
non-Western, non-ominous representations of the eclipse. I haven't come across that in planetarium shows. However, just a few weeks ago, that was actually one of the lectures in the speaker series, and the person that gave that talk went over lots of different cultural beliefs about solar eclipses, and there are a lot of them. So there are various different spiritual beliefs and just all sorts of stuff that people have in their cultures, but I haven't really seen those. Since I've looked primarily at the Adler and the Griffith, I haven't seen those things represented in a way. Yeah.
Do you find much difference in the music that planetariums use for solar eclipses compared to lunar eclipses?
Yes. So oftentimes, especially after the space race began, when projections of the moon were to be put on, planetarium directors would ask for like a cold, airless sounding music. And so the lunar eclipse, sometimes it's lumped into the same demonstration as the solar eclipse, but it's usually not. And so I didn't do a very close study on that for this particular project, but that would be something really interesting. Just based on my my knowledge now, I do think they usually represent it in a different way. That's a really good question. Was there a question over here? Yeah. Yeah. So information about the events on the 8th, if you're looking for BGSU specific information, all you really have to do is just Google BGSU solar eclipse, and you will be presented with all of the information that you could find. It's sent out in emails by the university on a daily and weekly basis. There are lots of different pages for specific festivities that will be going on. So you should be able to just kind of Google it, and a lot of stuff should come up.
Are you familiar with the song "Is the Storm" by Robert W. Smith?
I am not sure. Into the Storm. I'll write it down.
Robert W.
Thanks.
Robert W. Who?
Smith.
Smith. Unlikely sounding name up there.
Your question back there.
A lot of modifications have to be done in that area because the music became more common. When they first started, was it like a turntable or?
So,
was there a certain point when they just all started jumping on board with the song?
yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question. Planetariums did not care about music as much prior to the 1950s, and so there's very little documentation about what they were using. My assumption is that at least in the 30s, they were probably using some form of turntable or record player, right? But I do know that at the Griffith Planetarium in the mid to late 1950s, they completely renovated their sound systems and they put in a whole tape deck and turntables and everything in the back. And so they would have technicians go, they would pre-record these shows on tape, they would cut and splice their music at their own will to make them line up with the imagery. So at least in the 1950s, that was happening at Griffith. And I assume that sort of change happened to other places as well. But in terms of what was there before, it's a really excellent question. I tried to find out when I was at the Adler. They just didn't really have documentation about what they used. Okay. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about Adler and Griffith.
Hmm?
You mentioned Hayden earlier,
Mm-hmm.
but you haven't really mentioned what the Hayden has been doing for his music.
Sure. So the Hayden Planetarium is has a very similar trend. I haven't researched as deeply the Hayden. I mainly put that in to show these were like the big three planetariums. And so these planetariums and their actions had big consequences for other planetariums in the country. So I would like to go to the Hayden at some point and do archival research there as well. And there are lots of other smaller regional planetariums like in Dallas that I'd like to go visit. I really want to try to go visit the planetariums that had speakers at that symposium in 1958, because if they were sharing those ideas then, I'd like to see what kind of material they had at that time. Yeah.
You talk a lot about this idea of planetarium shows becoming more and more film-like. Do you think at this point the development of planetarium shows trends in music are distinct enough from film, or is this trend more so like a convergence of the two forms?
That's a really good question. So I think it's almost like a combination of like film and documentary. So there's this constant music in the background and it's setting mood, but it's not like action music or something like you would expect to see in a film. It has a much more, I don't want to say background effect because I don't think it's in the background. It is very intentional with what the music is trying to do. But I think there is a slight difference just because of the nature of the space. So now most shows are 30 minutes long. So composers try to experiment with different sounds based on the imagery they're going to be working with. But I do think there is like a combination between how documentaries would use music and with how films would use music. I hope that answered your question. Any more? Yeah.
All these studies you've done, I'm kind of interested. Have you kind of found out what kind of music should be played at a certain time? If it's, yeah.
So
Yeah, what conclusion have you come to?
So back when I first started my research, I only really knew about the space music that was in planetariums, and that's what I used to think should be in planetariums. But then as I did more research, I found that I kept finding more and more and more types of music that would be used, and especially with this archival research, I don't think that there is a specific type of music that should be used. I personally like it when like synthesized space music is used just because that's the environment that I enjoy, but I don't think that there's a right or wrong. I think every kind of like musical interpretation that I've seen in the planetarium has been equally valid. All right.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you.
I mean,